4:47 a.m., North Atlantic, 320 miles west of Ireland, March 16, 1943. Kapitänleutnant Klaus Hartmann's hands were shaking as he gripped the conning tower rail of U-427. Ice-cold spray hammered his face. Below him, in the cramped radio room, his operator Werner had just finished transmitting their position report. Standard procedure. 30 seconds of encrypted Morse code sent to BDU headquarters in Lorient. Routine communication that every U-boat captain sent twice daily without question. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Through the pre-dawn darkness, Hartmann saw them. Not one patrol aircraft, not two, seven. 7 consolidated Liberators converging on his exact position from different vectors, their navigation lights extinguished, flying at attack altitude. They hadn't been searching. They'd been waiting. Hunting. And somehow, impossibly, they knew exactly where U-427 would surface to transmit. Hartmann screamed the dive alarm, but he already knew the truth that would haunt him if he survived the next 10 minutes. His own radio had just killed his crew. The frequency he'd transmitted on, the frequency Berlin had ordered every U-boat to use, the frequency that was supposed to be their encrypted lifeline to command, had become their death sentence. And Hartmann had no idea that 300 miles away, in a freezing British station on the Scottish coast, a 19-year-old WREN operator had just triangulated his transmission in 45 seconds flat, feeding his coordinates directly to the aircraft that were now releasing depth charges into the black water above his diving submarine. The war in the Atlantic had just changed forever, and the Germans didn't even know they were already losing. Bletchley Park, England. The man who would accidentally help win the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't a codebreaker, wasn't a naval strategist, and certainly wasn't supposed to be at Bletchley Park at all. His name was Robert Farnsworth, and before the war, he'd been an electrical engineer for the BBC, specializing in radio transmission interference, the kind of mundane technical problem that made cocktail party conversations die instantly. Farnsworth was 42, balding, with thick spectacles that constantly slid down his nose when he bent over circuit diagrams. He wore the same brown cardigan every day, had never fired a weapon, and got seasick in bathtubs. When his conscription papers arrived in 1940, the Army took one look at his medical file: flat feet, chronic asthma, partial deafness in his left ear, and classified him 4F, unfit for military service. He should have spent the war making propaganda broadcasts or fixing transmitters for the Home Service. Instead, a bureaucratic error sent his file to the Admiralty's Technical Division, where someone noticed a single line on his CV. Doctoral thesis on triangulation of radio sources using multi-point signal analysis, Cambridge University, 1925. 3 days later, Farnsworth received a letter instructing him to report to Station X, a location he'd never heard of, for work of national importance that couldn't be specified. He assumed it was another radio station job. He packed his tools, his textbooks, and caught a train north, completely unaware that his obscure academic research was about to become the most deadly technology in the Atlantic. When Farnsworth arrived at Bletchley Park in January 1942, the war at sea was being catastrophically lost. In 1941 alone, German U-boats had sunk over 1,200 Allied ships, sending 5 million tons of desperately needed food, fuel, ammunition, and equipment to the bottom of the Atlantic. Britain was starving. Oil reserves were at 3 months. If the hemorrhaging continued, Churchill knew that his island nation would be forced to surrender, not by invasion, but by starvation, within a year. The problem was devastatingly simple. The Atlantic Ocean was too vast to patrol, and U-boats were too small, too fast, and too invisible to find. A submarine on the surface at night, painted grey, sitting low in the water, was essentially undetectable by aircraft or ships, unless you passed within a few hundred yards. The ocean covered 41 million square miles. The odds of randomly encountering a U-boat were astronomical. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, understood this mathematical reality perfectly. His strategy, the wolf pack tactic, exploited it ruthlessly. He positioned patrol lines of submarines across the known convoy routes. When one U-boat spotted a convoy, it wouldn't attack immediately. Instead, it would shadow the convoy and transmit its position, course, and speed to headquarters using encrypted Enigma messages. BDU would then vector every available U-boat in the region toward the convoy's projected path, creating a concentration of 15 or 20 submarines that would attack simultaneously at night, overwhelming the escorts. It was devastatingly effective. During the winter of 1941-42, U-boats were sinking ships faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. Merchant sailors had a lower survival rate than RAF bomber crews. The Atlantic was becoming a graveyard. The British codebreakers at Bletchley Park were making progress against some German Enigma variants. Army and Luftwaffe codes were being read with increasing regularity by late 1941. But naval Enigma, the cipher used by U-boats, remained impenetrable. The Kriegsmarine used different procedures, different rotor settings, and changed their codes more frequently than other German services. Without the ability to read U-boat messages, the Admiralty was fighting blind. And then, in February 1942, everything got worse. Admiral Dönitz, who had always been paranoid about code security, ordered the implementation of a new 4-rotor Enigma machine for U-boat communications. The previous 3-rotor version had given codebreakers a fighting chance, given enough intercepts and enough time. The 4-rotor variant, codenamed Shark by the Allies, increased the possible combinations so dramatically that Bletchley Park's methods became useless overnight. By March 1942, the British Admiralty had lost the ability to read any U-boat traffic. Convoys were being routed blind, sinkings spiked to catastrophic levels. In June 1942 alone, 144 Allied ships were destroyed. Admiral Dönitz began planning for Operation Paukenschlag, a massive U-boat offensive that would finally cut Britain's lifeline. Churchill was desperate. In secret cabinet meetings, he admitted that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. Without food, without fuel, without supplies from America, Britain would collapse. The codebreakers were working round the clock, but breaking Shark Enigma would take months, possibly years, if it could be done at all. Someone needed a different approach. Someone needed to find U-boats without reading their messages. That's when Robert Farnsworth walked into the wrong meeting. Rear Admiral John Clayton had assembled his convoy routing staff and intelligence officers to discuss the crisis. 47 ships sunk in the last 2 weeks, 16,000 tons of fuel oil at the bottom of the ocean, 300 sailors dead, and not a single reliable piece of intelligence about where the wolf packs were actually positioned. Farnsworth had been sent to fix a faulty intercom system in the adjacent room. He'd been told the meeting would be over by 10 a.m. It wasn't. He stood awkwardly in the hallway, toolbox in hand, while raised voices echoed through the door. "We're routing convoys on guesswork," someone shouted. "Historical positions, last known sightings from 3 weeks ago, statistical probability. We're sending men to their deaths based on 19-year-old charts and wishful thinking." "What choice do we have?" Clayton's voice was sharp with frustration. "Bletchley can't read the traffic. We have no intelligence. We can't see them." "Then we need to find another way to see them," another voice interjected. "The U-boats aren't ghosts. They're using radios constantly. Every time they spot a convoy, they transmit. Every time BDU redirects them, they transmit acknowledgements. They're out there screaming into the ether dozens of times a day, and we're acting like they're invisible." "Direction finding," Clayton said dismissively. "We've had HFDF stations since 1940. They're marginally useful for knowing a U-boat is somewhere in a 500-mile radius. That doesn't help us kill it. Then we need better equipment, better operators, better—" The door suddenly opened. An officer stepped out, nearly colliding with Farnsworth. "Who are you?" "Farnsworth, I'm here to fix the intercom." "Can you come back later? We're in the middle of—" "Did someone just mention high-frequency direction finding?" Farnsworth interrupted, his engineer's curiosity overriding his natural timidity. The officer blinked. "Yes, why?" "I wrote my doctoral thesis on triangulation of radio sources, multi-point signal analysis. You said 500-mile accuracy. That's absurd. With properly calibrated receivers and synchronized timing, you should be able to locate a transmission source to within 5 miles, possibly less." There was a pause. The officers stared at him. "Wait here." 2 minutes later, Farnsworth was standing in front of 8 senior naval officers and intelligence personnel. his toolbox still in his hand, explaining the mathematics of radio triangulation to people who looked at him like he'd just announced he could walk on water. "Gentlemen," Farnsworth said, pushing his spectacles up nervously, "the current direction-finding methodology is fundamentally flawed. You're using single-point bearings and trying to cross-reference them manually, which introduces enormous error margins. But if you network multiple stations, calibrate their receivers to detect the same transmissions simultaneously, and use synchronized timing to calculate the phase differences in signal arrival, you can establish an intersection point with remarkable precision." "How precise?" Clayton demanded. "With 3 properly positioned stations? I could locate a radio transmission in the North Atlantic to within a 10-mile radius, with 5 stations within 3 miles, and the calculation would take less than 2 minutes." The room went silent. "The U-boats transmit constantly," Farnsworth continued, gaining confidence. "Every position report, every sighting, every order acknowledgement. Those transmissions last 30 seconds, sometimes longer. If you have a network of synchronized direction-finding stations positioned around the Atlantic perimeter, Iceland, Scotland, Ireland, Newfoundland, you could plot every single transmission in real time. You wouldn't need to read the messages. You'd just need to know where they came from. And gentlemen, every U-boat that transmits tells you exactly where it is." Admiral Clayton leaned forward. "How fast could you build this network?" "The technology already exists," Farnsworth replied. "We just need to modify the equipment, train the operators, and establish the communication protocols for data sharing. 3 months, maybe 4. You have 6 weeks." Radio direction finding wasn't new. It had been used for aircraft navigation and maritime rescue for years, but achieving the accuracy he promised required solving a dozen technical problems simultaneously. The first challenge was synchronization. For triangulation to work, multiple stations hundreds of miles apart needed to detect the exact same transmission and record the precise moment it arrived at each location. The phase difference, the tiny fraction of a second delay between when the radio wave reached Station A versus Station B, was what allowed you to calculate position. But measuring those microsecond differences required clocks accurate to within milliseconds, synchronized across vast distances, in an era before atomic clocks or satellite timing systems existed. Farnsworth's solution was brilliantly simple. He didn't synchronize the clocks at all. Instead, he synchronized the operators. He trained each station to start their stopwatch at the exact beginning of a transmission, identified by a specific frequency spike, and record the signal's bearing and duration. The data was then transmitted via dedicated telephone lines to a central plotting room, where Farnsworth's team had built a massive mechanical calculator, essentially a room-sized analog computer made of gears, pulleys, and calibrated slide rules that could solve the triangulation equations in under 90 seconds. The second challenge was operator skill, detecting a faint 30-second transmission in the electromagnetic chaos of the North Atlantic, distinguishing it from weather static, other naval traffic, and German decoys, required an almost musical sense of rhythm and pattern. Farnsworth needed operators who could hear the difference between a U-boat's transmission and background noise, identify the signal frequency instantly, and lock their receivers onto it without hesitation. He found his operators in an unexpected place, the Women's Royal Naval Service. Young women recruited from across Britain, many of them former telephone switchboard operators, musicians and radio enthusiasts who possessed the manual dexterity, patience, and auditory discrimination that the job required. Within weeks, Farnsworth had trained a team of 30 WREN operators who could detect and classify German transmissions faster than the male radio officers they were replacing. By late May 1942, the network was operational. 5 primary stations in Scotland, Iceland, Northern Ireland, Newfoundland, and Gibraltar, backed by mobile shipboard units that could extend coverage. Every station connected by dedicated submarine telephone cables to the Admiralty's submarine tracking room in London, where a staff of plotters maintained a massive wall chart of the Atlantic, updating U-boat positions in real time based on Farnsworth's triangulation data. The system was codenamed Huff Duff, naval slang for HFDF, high-frequency direction finding. But within weeks, officers were calling it something else. The Trap. Because Robert Farnsworth had just turned every German U-boat radio into a homing beacon. 90 currently on patrol, 43 en route to or from operational areas, the rest in port for resupply, repair or crew rotation. The numbers were good, better than good. In the first 5 months of 1942, his boats had sunk 585 Allied ships. The Americans, who had entered the war in December, were proving to be disastrously unprepared. U-boats operating off the American coast were sinking tankers and freighters in sight of the beaches. American newspapers were calling it the second happy time, but Dönitz was troubled. He'd received reports from several returning commanders that troubled him deeply, not about combat, not about weapons or tactics, about something far more subtle and far more concerning. U-557's captain reported that while shadowing a convoy south of Greenland, he had transmitted his position report at dawn, standard procedure. 20 minutes later, not hours, minutes, a British destroyer had appeared on the horizon, steaming directly toward his position at flank speed, as if it knew exactly where he was. He'd been forced to crash dive and abandon the attack. U-162 reported a similar experience. After transmitting a weather report, mandatory protocol, it had been bracketed by depth charges from a corvette that seemed to appear from nowhere, despite having clear horizons in all directions moments before the transmission. U-461, a supply submarine, had been attacked by aircraft within an hour of transmitting its rendezvous coordinates to boats that needed refueling. The aircraft hadn't been searching. It had flown directly to the exact position where U-461 was waiting. 3 incidents could be coincidence, but Dönitz was receiving similar reports from a dozen boats, transmissions followed by immediate, precise enemy responses. Not always, but often enough to be statistically impossible as random chance. Dönitz called his staff together. "They're finding us when we transmit," he said bluntly. "I don't know how. Our encryption is unbreakable. Enigma has never been compromised, but somehow they're detecting our radio traffic and acting on it." His communications officer shook his head. "Impossible, Herr Admiral. Even if they had direction-finding equipment, the accuracy would be kilometers, useless for vectoring ships or aircraft to specific locations." "Then explain the pattern." "Bad luck. The Atlantic is becoming more heavily patrolled. Aircraft range is increasing. Radar doesn't explain a destroyer appearing 20 minutes after a transmission. Not when that transmission was the first radio activity in that sector for 8 hours. The room fell silent. "We need to investigate this," Dönitz continued, "carefully. If they have a new detection method, we need to understand it and counter it. In the meantime, issue new protocols. Minimize transmission time, no more than 15 seconds per message. Surface only when absolutely necessary. If a boat must transmit, dive immediately afterward and change position by at least 30 kilometers before resurfacing." His staff nodded, taking notes. What Dönitz couldn't know, was that his new protocols were already too late, because in a plotting room in London, young women wearing headphones were marking his submarines on a map faster than he could move them, and every time a U-boat transmitted, even for 15 seconds, it drew a target on its own position. The trap had closed. The Germans just didn't realize they were already inside it. June 14, 1942, 11:23 p.m., submarine tracking room, Admiralty Building, London. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and the mechanical clicking of plot markers being moved across the massive wall chart. 23 people worked in near silence, their faces illuminated by the green glow of shaded desk lamps. This was the nerve center of the Atlantic War, a claustrophobic space where the fate of convoys, submarines, and thousands of lives was decided by the movement of colored pins on a map. Commander Richard Hall stood before the chart, studying the latest positions. Red pins represented known or suspected U-boat locations. Blue lines traced convoy routes. Black pins marked sinkings from the last 72 hours. There were too many black pins. A buzzer sounded, sharp, insistent. "Contact," called out WREN's second officer Patricia Morrison from her station near the telephone bank. She was 20 years old, former music student from Cardiff, recruited 6 weeks earlier because she could identify a U-boat's transmission signature by the slight frequency wobble caused by diesel engine vibration. Station 3 and Station 7 simultaneously. Signal duration 28 seconds. Bearing computed. She handed a slip of paper to a plotter, who moved quickly to the chart and placed a small yellow flag on the Atlantic grid. Position 53 degree 12 aft north, 28 40 Queen west. Hall checked his watch and made a note. Within 90 seconds of the transmission ending, they had a position accurate to within 5 miles. It still felt like magic, even after 6 weeks of operation. "Any assets in range?" he asked. A young sub-lieutenant consulted the surface plot. HMS Wanderer corvette, currently 42 miles southeast, could intercept in approximately 3 hours if the U-boat maintains position. "And if it dives and relocates?" "Then we've lost it, sir." Hall stared at the chart. This was the fundamental problem with Huff Duff. It told you where a U-boat was at the moment of transmission, but submarines moved. A U-boat running surfaced at 15 knots could be 30 miles away in 2 hours, and once submerged, it was invisible again. Unless... "What's the U-boat's likely mission?" Hall asked. "Why was it transmitting?" Morrison consulted her log. "Signal characteristics match a convoy sighting report. Standard transmission pattern, extended duration for coordinates and ship count." Hall's eyes narrowed. If the U-boat had spotted a convoy, it would shadow that convoy, staying surfaced to maintain visual contact and transmit updates, which meant it would be forced to transmit again. Soon. "Alert HMS Wanderer," Hall ordered. "Vector to intercept, but do not engage on arrival. Hold position and wait. When that U-boat transmits again, and it will, we'll have a fresh position. Then we strike." It was a new tactic, and it was working. 2 hours and 17 minutes later, the buzzer sounded again. Same U-boat, now 31 miles northwest of the previous position, exactly as Hall had predicted. HMS Wanderer was now only 12 miles away. "Send them in," Hall said quietly. By dawn, U-573 was at the bottom of the Atlantic, crushed by depth charges, 47 men dead. The convoy it had been shadowing sailed on, completely unaware that a submarine hunting them had just been hunted in return. It was the first kill directly attributable to Huff Duff. It would not be the last. They refined the triangulation algorithms. They trained more operators. And most importantly, they began to understand the patterns. U-boats didn't transmit randomly. They transmitted according to strict protocols established by Admiral Dönitz. Morning position reports, always between 0400 and 0600 hours. Weather reports, twice daily. Convoy sighting reports, immediately upon contact. Acknowledgements of orders from BDU. Supply rendezvous coordinates. Every transmission followed predictable formats, durations, and timing windows. The tracking room staff, led by a brilliant civilian analyst named Roger Wynne, began to build psychological profiles of individual U-boat commanders based on their radio behavior. Some captains transmitted exactly on schedule, never deviating. Others were erratic, sometimes early, sometimes late. Some used minimal transmission time. Others were verbose. These behavioral fingerprints allowed the tracking room to not just locate U-boats, but to identify which specific boat was transmitting, cross-referencing with known deployment schedules and patrol areas. They were building a real-time database of the entire U-boat fleet. And then someone had a brilliant, terrible idea. If you knew where a U-boat was when it transmitted, and you knew where it had been at previous transmissions, you could calculate its course and speed. And if you knew its course and speed, you could predict where it would be hours or even days later, even if it didn't transmit again. The mathematics were complex, requiring assumptions about submarine fuel consumption, patrol patterns, and mission objectives. But Wynne's team was good at assumptions, very good. By August 1942, they were plotting predicted U-boat positions on the chart alongside confirmed ones, and they were routing convoys around those predictions. The effect was immediate and devastating. Convoys that should have been intercepted sailed through Wolfpack patrol lines untouched. U-boats that surfaced expecting to find targets found empty ocean. Supply submarines arriving at rendezvous coordinates found no customers, because the boats they were supposed to refuel had been depth-charged days earlier, their positions betrayed by routine weather reports. In June 1942, before Huff Duff became fully operational, U-boats sank 144 Allied ships. In July, 96 ships. In August, 108 ships, but with 3 times as many U-boats on patrol, meaning efficiency per submarine had dropped by 2/3. Admiral Dunitz knew something was catastrophically wrong. He just didn't know what. Send the morning position report. Submerge at first light. U-427 had been at sea for 41 days, hunting in the North Atlantic convoy lanes. They'd sunk 2 freighters and damaged a tanker. Respectable results. Hartmann's crew was exhausted but functional. They had enough fuel and supplies for another 3 weeks on station. But Hartmann was troubled by something he couldn't articulate. A feeling, an instinct developed over 27 months of combat patrols. Something wasn't right. 3 days earlier, he'd transmitted a convoy sighting report. Standard procedure. 2 hours later, a destroyer had appeared on the horizon, steaming directly toward his position. He'd crash-dived and evaded, but the coincidence bothered him. Destroyers didn't randomly appear in empty ocean. They were vectored, directed. But how? His radio officer, Werner Krauss, approached from the conning tower hatch. "Ready to transmit morning report, Herr Kalyun." Hartmann hesitated. The order from BDU was clear. All boats must report position daily. It was essential for coordinating Wolfpack operations and tracking the fleet, but every instinct screamed at him to maintain radio silence. "Delay transmission," Hartmann said suddenly. "Hold position for 30 minutes. Werner looked confused. "Sir? The transmission window—" "I said delay." Werner retreated below. Hartmann scanned the horizon with his binoculars. Nothing. Empty sea. Dark sky. No aircraft. No ships. Just the endless roll of Atlantic swells. 30 minutes passed. Still nothing. "All right," Hartmann said finally, feeling foolish. "Transmit." Werner encoded the message using his Enigma machine, converted it to Morse code, and transmitted 32 seconds of encrypted radio signal containing U-427's position, course, weather conditions, and fuel state. The transmission ended. Werner secured the radio and climbed back to the bridge. "Message sent, Herr Kalyun." Hartmann nodded. "Clear the bridge, prepare to dive." They would surface again at dusk, standard procedure. What Hartmann didn't know was that 892 miles away, in a listening station on the Scottish coast, WREN Second Officer Patricia Morrison had just detected his transmission. Her pencil moved across the plotting sheet, marking the bearing, 247 degrees. She picked up the telephone. "Tracking room, this is Station 3, U-boat transmission detected, duration 32 seconds, bearing 247, signal strength moderate, likely range between 200 and 400 miles. In Iceland, Station 5 had detected the same transmission, bearing 198 degrees. In Newfoundland, Station 8 caught it faintly, bearing 087 degrees. The 3 bearings converged on the chart in London. Within 70 seconds of Werner's transmission ending, Commander Hall placed a yellow flag at position 53 degrees, 12E north, 28 degrees 40s west. U-427's exact location. Hall checked his surface plot. HMS Wanderer, the same corvette that had killed U-573 in June, was 130 miles northeast, too far for immediate intercept. But convoy HX-198 was 200 miles southwest, heading directly into U-427's patrol area. If U-427 maintained its position and transmitted again at dusk, Wanderer could be in attack range within hours. Hall made a note on the tracking sheet. "Monitor for evening transmission, vector Wanderer to intercept." Klaus Hartmann was now being hunted, and he had no idea the hunt had already begun. The mathematical complexity of the 4-rotor naval Enigma, with its billions of possible combinations, made brute force decryption effectively impossible with 1942 technology. German commanders transmitted freely, confident that even if messages were intercepted, they could never be read. But the Germans made a critical error in their operational security doctrine. They assumed that transmission detection and message decryption were the same problem. They weren't. Admiral Dunitz had focused obsessively on encryption security. He changed rotor settings daily, implemented complex authentication procedures, and maintained strict discipline about message content. But he never seriously considered that simply transmitting, regardless of encryption, could be exploited as an intelligence source. This was the illegal aspect referenced in the story's title, though not illegal in the legal sense. It was illegal in the sense of being outside the established rules of the cryptographic game. It was cheating. The British weren't playing by breaking the code, they were playing by not even trying to break it. They were doing something the Germans thought was impossible, achieving tactical precision from strategic detection. Robert Farnsworth had found the exploit. And unlike breaking Enigma, which required captured machines, codebooks, and brilliant mathematicians working for months, Huff Duff worked immediately, worked constantly, and worked on every single transmission the Germans made. The U-boats couldn't fight back against it because they didn't know it existed, and even when they suspected something was wrong, they couldn't stop transmitting without crippling their own operational coordination. The Germans had built their entire Atlantic strategy on radio communication and encrypted coordination. Huff Duff turned that strength into a fatal vulnerability. By September 1942, the tracking room was plotting an average of 47 U-boat positions per day. Not from breaking codes, from listening to the submarines announce their own locations. "Someone explained to me," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "how convoy on 127 sailed directly through the middle of Gruppe Lo's patrol line without a single contact. 8 boats, perfectly positioned, exactly where the convoy should have been. And they found nothing." His operations officer consulted the chart. "The convoy must have been diverted, Herr Admiral. Intelligence failure. Perhaps the British broke our—" "No," Dönitz interrupted. "Enigma has not been compromised. I've had our cryptographers analyze the traffic. No evidence of decryption, no evidence of code penetration. But they're evading our patrol lines with impossible accuracy, which means they're detecting us somehow." He turned to his communications officer. "How many boats have reported being attacked shortly after transmitting?" 17 confirmed incidents in the last 6 weeks, Herr Admiral. But correlation doesn't necessarily— 17 is not coincidence, Dönitz snapped. "They're finding us through our radio transmissions. I don't know the mechanism, but the pattern is undeniable. Even if they have direction-finding equipment," another officer ventured, "the accuracy would be insufficient for tactical vectoring. We're talking about hundreds of kilometers of ocean. Then their equipment is better than we thought." Dönitz began pacing. "Effective immediately. New protocols. All boats are to minimize transmission duration to absolute minimum. No more than 10 seconds per message. Use abbreviated code phrases only. No transmission of precise positions unless operationally critical. And any boat that transmits must immediately relocate at least 50 kilometers before next transmission." He paused, staring at the operations map. "We're being hunted, gentlemen, and until we understand how, we're fighting blind." The new protocols were distributed fleet-wide within 48 hours, but the damage was already done. The tracking room had 6 months of data on U-boat behavior patterns, patrol areas, and operational doctrine. Even with reduced transmissions, they could interpolate positions, predict movements, and route convoys accordingly. And the WREN operators had become so skilled that they could extract actionable intelligence from transmissions as short as 8 seconds. The trap had evolved. It was now a net so fine that the U-boats couldn't slip through it, no matter how carefully they tried to swim. October 1942, the turning point. The statistics told the story that operational reports couldn't hide. In October 1942, despite having more U-boats operational than ever before, sinking rates dropped to their lowest levels since 1940. Simultaneously, U-boat losses began climbing. 87 U-boats had been destroyed in the first 2 years of the war. In the 6 months following Huff Duff implementation, 41 boats were sunk, nearly half of all previous losses compressed into half a year. The mortality rate for U-boat crews, which had been approximately 25% through 1941, rose to 43% by the end of 1942. Submariners began calling their boats iron coffins. The psychological effect was devastating. German crews who had once been confident hunters became nervous prey. And still, most of them never understood what was killing them. Kapitänleutnant Klaus Hartmann survived his August patrol. He returned to Lorient, filed his report, and requested an investigation into what he described as impossibly accurate British interception tactics. His report was filed alongside 37 others making similar observations. German naval intelligence conducted an investigation. They tested their Enigma machines. They interrogated prisoners. They analyzed captured British equipment. They found nothing conclusive. Some German officers began to suspect that Enigma had been compromised, despite cryptographic analysis showing no evidence of code breaking. Others blamed improved Allied radar. Some suggested traitors in the U-boat service feeding positions to the British. The truth, that radio direction finding technology had reached a level of precision they thought impossible, remained beyond their analytical framework. It violated their assumptions about the fundamental capabilities of 1940s electronics. By late 1942, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park finally achieved reliable breaks into naval Enigma, giving the Allies the ability to read German messages in addition to locating their sources. The combination of Huff-Duff and Enigma decryption was absolutely lethal. But even without the code breaking, Huff-Duff alone had shifted the balance. Robert Farnsworth's system had bought Britain the time it needed to survive the critical period when naval Enigma was unreadable. A BBC engineer with flat feet and thick spectacles had saved the Atlantic War. And he'd done it not by being smarter than the German cryptographers, but by asking a different question. Not, how do we read their messages? But, do we even need to? Sometimes the most devastating weapon is the one your enemy doesn't believe exists. March 16, 1943, 04:47 a.m., U-427, North Atlantic. Klaus Hartmann's mind raced through his options as U-427 plunged into darkness beneath the waves. The dive alarm was still screaming. His crew moved with practiced efficiency, but Hartmann could see the fear in their eyes. They'd all seen what he'd seen, 7 aircraft converging on their position with impossible precision. "Level at 60 meters, he ordered, forcing his voice to remain calm. "Silent running, all unnecessary equipment offline." The boat creaked and groaned as it descended. Through the hull, faint at first, then growing louder, came the sound every submariner dreaded, the high-pitched whine of aircraft engines directly overhead. "Prepare for depth charges," Hartmann said quietly. The first explosions came 30 seconds later. Not random scatterbombing, not a wide search pattern. Precise, concentrated. The aircraft knew exactly where U-427 had dived, and they were methodically working the area, dropping charges in a grid that was tightening with each pass. The boat shuddered violently. Light bulbs shattered. A sailor screamed as a steam pipe ruptured, spraying scalding water across the engine room. Hartmann gripped the periscope housing as the world tilted sideways. "Damage report! Minor flooding in compartment 3, seals holding, rudder control sluggish but responsive." Another explosion, closer. The hull groaned under the pressure. Paint flaked from the overhead pipes. A young machinist vomited into a bucket, overwhelmed by fear and diesel fumes. Hartmann checked his watch. They'd been down 4 minutes. The aircraft would have enough fuel for maybe 30 more minutes of attack before having to return to base. If U-427 could survive that long, they might escape. But Hartmann knew the truth that none of his crew had yet realized. This wasn't about surviving this attack. This was about understanding how the attack had happened at all. 7 aircraft didn't converge on a random patch of Atlantic at dawn unless they knew something. And the only thing U-427 had done in the last 12 hours that could have revealed their position was transmit a single 30-second radio message. His own procedure had killed them, or would kill them if Hartmann didn't figure out what was happening and how to counter it. U-427 had been tracked continuously for the last 18 hours through 4 separate transmissions. Its course and speed had been calculated with remarkable accuracy. HMS Wanderer and 2 other corvettes were now converging on the area, vectored by aircraft that had spotted the submarine's crash dive. "Surface assets arriving on station in approximately 40 minutes, reported the duty officer. "Aircraft report multiple depth charge runs. No confirmed kill yet, but the target is contained." Hall nodded. This was the new warfare. Not random encounters, not lucky sightings. Systematic hunting based on mathematical precision and electronic intelligence. "Any other contacts in the sector?" 3 possible positions based on overnight intercepts: Grid B4217, AL8834, and CF1156. We're monitoring for confirmation transmissions. The wall chart showed the entire Atlantic theater. Red pins marked known U-boat positions. Yellow flags indicated probable locations based on triangulation. Blue lines traced convoy routes, now deliberately plotted to avoid the red and yellow markers by hundreds of miles. In the corner of the room, WREN operators sat at their stations, headphones on, fingers poised over their plotting instruments, listening to the electromagnetic whispers of submarines that thought they were invisible. Patricia Morrison adjusted her receiver, tracking through the frequency bands. Static, whale song, more static. Then, faint but distinct, the characteristic rhythm of a U-boat transmission. Short burst, slight frequency wobble, precise timing. "Contact," she called out. "Station 3, detecting transmission. Bearing 193 degrees, signal strength weak. Estimated range over 500 miles. Another plotter moved to the chart. Another yellow flag appeared. The net was tightening, and the Germans still didn't fully understand they were caught in it. The attacks had stopped 15 minutes ago. The aircraft had exhausted their ordnance and fuel and had departed. U-427 had survived, badly shaken but intact. Hartmann waited another 30 minutes before ordering the boat to periscope depth. He swept the horizon slowly. Empty. No ships. No aircraft. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of grey and pink. Surface the boat. All hands to damage control. I want a full assessment in 10 minutes. U-427 broached the surface. Hartmann climbed to the bridge, breathing deeply of the cold Atlantic air. His boat was alive. His crew was alive. They'd been lucky, but luck wasn't a strategy. Werner approached from below. "Herr Kapitän, BDU is requesting our status report. They're asking why we missed our scheduled transmission." Hartmann stared at him. "When was our last transmission?" 0415, sir, the morning position report." "And when did the aircraft appear?" "Approximately 0447. 32 minutes. Hartmann felt ice in his stomach. 32 minutes between transmitting and being attacked by aircraft that had flown directly to his exact position. It wasn't coincidence. It was causation. "Werner, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it without asking questions." "Of course, Herr Kapitän. I want you to compile data from our patrol logs, every transmission we've made in the last 40 days, date, time, position, and duration. Then cross-reference with any enemy contact we had afterward. Look for patterns, time gaps between transmission and contact, directions of approach, anything unusual." Werner looked confused but nodded. "Yes, sir. May I ask what you're looking for?" "I'm looking for proof that our own radios are killing us. What Klaus Hartmann was beginning to suspect, and what German naval intelligence had failed to fully grasp, was the revolutionary precision of Allied direction-finding technology. The Germans knew that radio direction-finding existed. They even used it themselves. But they fundamentally underestimated how accurate it had become. Traditional direction-finding in 1942 worked by rotating a loop antenna until you found the bearing with the strongest signal. This gave you a line on a map. The transmission came from somewhere along this bearing. If you had 2 stations, you got 2 lines, and where they intersected was the approximate source location. The problem was accuracy. Small errors in bearing measurement caused by atmospheric refraction, signal reflection, or equipment calibration issues meant that an intersection point could be off by 50 miles or more. Farnsworth's innovation was multi-point correlation, combined with signal timing analysis. Instead of 2 stations, he used 5 or more, and instead of just plotting bearing lines, his system measured the microsecond differences in signal arrival time at each station. Radio waves travel at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second, but the Atlantic Ocean is big enough that even at that speed, a transmission takes measurable fractions of a second longer to reach Iceland than it does to reach Scotland. By precisely measuring those tiny time differences and combining them with bearing data from multiple stations, Farnsworth's mechanical calculator could solve a complex triangulation equation that pinpointed the transmission source with astonishing accuracy. 3 to 5 miles in good conditions. 10 miles in poor weather with atmospheric interference. For a U-boat traveling at 12 knots surfaced, that meant even an hour after transmission, it would only be 12 miles from the detected position, well within the search radius of aircraft with radar or experienced lookouts. But the system's true genius was its operational integration. The triangulation data wasn't just collected. It was immediately fed to the tracking room, where analysts combined it with previous positions, known patrol patterns, convoy locations, and decoded Enigma messages when available, to build a complete operational picture. The tracking room could predict where a U-boat would be hours before it arrived. They could identify which boats were hunting, which were returning home, which were damaged and moving slowly. They could calculate fuel states based on days at sea and position changes. They could even identify individual commanders based on their radio discipline and movement patterns. It was total information dominance, achieved not through breaking the code, but through exploiting the transmission itself, and the Germans had no countermeasure because they didn't believe the threat existed. The young radio officer had spent 36 hours analyzing the patrol logs, and what he'd found had clearly shaken him. Herr Kalun, you were right. The pattern is undeniable. Hartmann read through the summary. 23 transmissions during the patrol. 14 followed by enemy contact within 6 hours. Of those 14, 9 involved aircraft or ships approaching from directions that suggested they'd been vectored specifically to U-427's transmitted position. The average time gap between transmission and first enemy contact is 2 hours and 47 minutes, Werner continued, which matches almost exactly the time required for an aircraft flying at 200 kilometers per hour to reach our position from the nearest British bases in Iceland or Scotland. Hartmann felt sick every time they'd followed orders. Every time they'd transmitted their required position reports, weather data or sighting information, they'd painted a target on their own boat. There's more, Werner said quietly. I asked the radio operators on 3 other boats in port to run the same analysis on their patrols. Same pattern. U-203, 17 transmissions, 11 followed by contact. U-558, 21 transmissions, 13 contacts. U-162 was sunk 2 weeks ago, but according to survivors, they transmitted a supply rendezvous coordinate and were attacked by aircraft 38 minutes later. 38 minutes, Hartmann repeated. Not hours, minutes. Yes, sir. Which means the British aren't just detecting our transmissions, they're triangulating our exact positions and immediately vectoring assets to intercept, in real time. Hartmann closed the report. This needs to go to BDU immediately, not through radio. I'll present it in person when we return to port. Herr Kalun, if you're right, if they can locate us every time we transmit, then how do we coordinate Wolfpack operations? How do we report convoy sightings? How do we receive orders? Hartmann didn't have an answer. The Germans had built their entire submarine warfare doctrine on radio coordination. Take that away, and the U-boats became isolated hunters operating blind, unable to concentrate force or share intelligence. The British had found the exploit, and there was no easy fix. The British have achieved a level of direction-finding precision that we believe to be technically impossible with current technology. And countermeasures? The communications officer hesitated. Limited options, sir. We could reduce transmission frequency, but that would cripple operational coordination. We could reduce transmission duration, which we've already implemented, but if they can triangulate a signal in 30 seconds, cutting it to 15 seconds won't significantly improve survival rates. We could implement random transmission timing to prevent predictability, but that would cause coordination problems. Or we could impose radio silence entirely, which would essentially end Wolfpack operations. Dunnet stood and walked to the operations map. The Atlantic was marked with patrol zones, convoy routes, and the last known positions of his boats. So many boats. 212 operational submarines, the largest U-boat fleet Germany had ever fielded, and they were being hunted with a weapon he couldn't counter. Gentlemen, Dunnet said slowly, we are facing a crisis that could end the U-boat war. If the British can locate every transmission in real time, then every submarine that follows current communication protocols is at severe risk. Our sinking rates are dropping. Our loss rates are climbing, and now we know why. He turned to face his staff. Effective immediately, fleet-wide directive. All boats are to minimize radio usage to absolute operational necessity only. No routine position reports unless operationally critical. No weather reports unless specifically requested by BDU. All transmissions to be limited to 10 seconds maximum, using pre-arranged code phrases only. Boats are to change position by minimum 50 kilometers before and after any transmission, and we are to begin developing alternative communication methods that don't rely on high-frequency radio. Alternative methods, Herr Admiral, someone asked. Low-frequency communication, underwater acoustic signals, physical message drops. Anything that doesn't broadcast our positions to the entire British listening network. Dönitz's voice was bitter. We have been operating under the assumption that encryption security was sufficient. We were wrong. The British aren't reading our messages. They're using our transmissions as homing beacons. And until we can counter this capability, we are fighting at a catastrophic disadvantage. The room was silent. One more thing, Dönitz added. This information is classified at the highest level. If the British learn that we've discovered their detection method, they may modify their tactics or develop new ones. Our only advantage now is knowing that we're being hunted. We must use that knowledge carefully. But it was already too late. The damage was done. The psychological impact of realizing that every transmission risked immediate counterattack spread through the U-boat fleet like poison. Commanders became reluctant to report sightings, fearing they'd be killed before they could attack. Coordination broke down. Wolfpack tactics became impossible to execute effectively. The weapon that had made the U-boat fleet deadly, reliable radio communication, had been turned into a liability so severe that using it was almost suicidal. Robert Farnsworth's trap had worked precisely because the Germans had built their entire operational doctrine on an assumption about technological limitations that was no longer true. They'd been fighting the last war, while the British had invented a new one. For the first time since the war began, U-boats were being sunk faster than they could achieve significant results. The moral balance was shifting. Allied merchant sailors, who had endured 3 years of slaughter, began to believe they might survive. U-boat crews, who had once been confident hunters, began writing farewell letters before every patrol. And in the submarine tracking room in London, the WREN operators continued their silent vigil, listening to the electromagnetic voices of submarines that were learning, too late, that invisibility meant nothing if you insisted on announcing your position. Commander Hall stood before the wall chart one evening in late April, studying the declining number of red pins. The Atlantic was becoming safer. Convoys were getting through. Britain would not starve. "Sir," Patricia Morrison called from her station. "Contact, Station 3 and Station 7, bearing plotted." Hall walked to the chart. Another yellow flag. Another U-boat located. Another target marked for hunting. "Any assets in range?" "HMS Hesperus, destroyer, 40 miles northeast. Can intercept in 90 minutes. Vector them in." The routine had become mechanical. Detect, plot, vector, attack. The U-boats were still dangerous, but they were no longer invisible. And in modern warfare, invisibility was everything. The trap had closed completely, and the U-boats, despite now understanding what was happening, couldn't escape, because escaping meant abandoning the radio coordination that made them effective. They were caught between two impossible choices: transmit and be hunted, or maintain silence and fight blind. Either way, they were losing. May 24th, 1943, 02:33 a.m., U-427, final patrol. Klaus Hartmann had been at sea for 53 days. This would be his last patrol. He'd already decided, not because of cowardice, not because of exhaustion, though God knew he was exhausted, but because he'd spent 2 months watching his fellow commanders die, and he understood with crystal clarity that the war they'd been trained to fight no longer existed. U-427 was running on the surface, charging batteries in the pre-dawn darkness. The sea was calm, the sky was clear. Perfect conditions for a transmission. And BDU was demanding his position report, third request in 6 hours. The orders were explicit. All boats must report daily, regardless of operational security concerns. Admiral Dönitz needed to know where his fleet was positioned for a major coordinated operation planned for June. Hartmann stood on the bridge, staring at the radio room hatch. Werner was waiting below with the encoded message ready. All Hartmann had to do was give the order. But he knew what would happen. 30 minutes after transmitting, maybe an hour if they were lucky, aircraft would appear. Or a destroyer would emerge from darkness, and U-427 would dive, and the depth charges would fall, and maybe this time they wouldn't survive. He'd watched it happen to 7 boats in his flotilla. U-203 sunk 3 days after transmitting a weather report. U-5558 destroyed by aircraft 42 minutes after reporting a convoy sighting. U-186, U-273, U-376, all gone. All killed shortly after transmissions. The British weren't guessing anymore. They weren't getting lucky. They were hunting with precision that bordered on supernatural. "Herr Kaleun," Werner called from below. "BDU is repeating the transmission order. They're threatening disciplinary action for radio silence." Hartmann closed his eyes. He'd sworn an oath. To Germany, to the Kriegsmarine, to Admiral Dönitz. That oath demanded obedience even when obedience meant death. "Transmit," Hartmann said quietly. "Then sound dive alarm immediately. We're going deep before the message even finishes sending." Werner's voice came back, uncertain. "Sir, that violates protocol. We're supposed to remain surface to receive acknowledgement." "I don't care about protocol," Hartmann snapped. "Transmit and dive now." 30 seconds later, Werner's Morse key began chattering. U-427's position, fuel state, weather conditions, all encrypted in unbreakable Enigma code, broadcast into the night on a frequency that Berlin assured them was secure. Hartmann counted in his head. 10 seconds, 15, 20. "Cut transmission! Dive! Dive! Dive!" The alarm shrieked. U-427's bow dipped forward. The Atlantic swallowed them whole. At 847 miles away, in a listening station on the Scottish coast, Patricia Morrison's pencil marked a bearing on her plotting sheet, and she reached for the telephone. Commander Hall studied the chart. U-427 again, Klaus Hartmann's boat. Hall had been tracking this particular submarine for 3 months. Hartmann was good, cautious. He'd survived longer than most because he never followed predictable patterns, never transmitted longer than absolutely necessary, and never surfaced in the same area twice. But even the cautious ones eventually had to transmit, and when they did, the net caught them. Surface assets. HMS Starling and HMS WREN, both sloops, currently 83 miles south-southeast, can intercept in approximately 4 hours if target maintains general area. Vector them in, and scramble air patrol from Iceland. I want continuous coverage of that sector starting at first light. Hall made a notation on Hartmann's tracking card. 3rd transmission this patrol, each one giving away his position, each one drawing the noose tighter. "Sir," a young WREN officer said hesitantly, "the transmission was cut short, 17 seconds, almost like he knew we were listening and dove before completing the message." Hall nodded slowly. He does know. Or suspects. The smart ones have figured it out by now. But it doesn't matter. Knowing you're being hunted doesn't help if you can't stop announcing your position. The girl looked troubled. "Doesn't seem quite fair, does it? They're just following orders from their command. They have to transmit." "War isn't fair," Hall said, not unkindly, "and I'd rather it be unfair in our direction. Those submarines were sinking our merchant ships, killing our sailors, starving our country. If their own procedures are now killing them instead, that's justice, not cruelty." He turned back to the chart. 43 U-boats sunk in the last 4 months. Convoy losses down by 72% compared to the previous year. The Atlantic was becoming an allied sea again. And every single one of those victories had started with a WREN operator, hearing a brief whisper of radio energy and marking a bearing on a plotting sheet. Robert Farnsworth's impossible system had worked, better than anyone had dared hope. Sunderland flying boats and Liberators, working in coordinated rotation, dropping depth charges in a pattern so precise it seemed they could see through the water. U-427 twisted and dove, seeking the thermal layers where sonar worked poorly, but the attacks followed. The British weren't guessing. They knew exactly where the submarine had gone. An explosion shattered the aft ballast tank. Water flooded into the stern compartment. The boat took a down angle, plummeting toward crush depth. "Blow all tanks, emergency surface. All hands prepare to abandon ship. U-427 shot upward, breaching the surface like a wounded whale. Hartmann threw open the hatch and climbed out into hell. 3 aircraft were already banking toward them, machine guns chattering. Bullets sparked off the conning tower. One of his lookouts dropped, blood spreading across the deck. "Abandon ship! Everyone out! Abandon ship!" The crew poured from the hatches, jumping into the icy Atlantic. The aircraft circled but held fire, watching to ensure the submarine was actually sinking and not attempting to fight. U-427 settled lower in the water. The stern was completely flooded. The bow was rising at a 45-degree angle. She had maybe 3 minutes before she went down. Hartmann was the last man off. He stood on the tilted deck, one hand gripping the periscope housing, watching his boat die. 43 days of hunting. 7 enemy ships sunk or damaged. 52 men brought safely through the most dangerous waters on Earth. All ended because he transmitted a 30-second radio message. The Atlantic claimed U-427 at 07:23 a.m. She slipped beneath the waves, stern first, her bow pointing skyward one final moment before vanishing completely. 47 of her 52 crew survived to be picked up by HMS Starling 3 hours later. Klaus Hartmann spent the rest of the war in a POW camp in Scotland, where he wrote a detailed report on his suspicions about British direction-finding capabilities. The report was smuggled to German intelligence through the Red Cross, but by the time it arrived, the war was already lost. German naval intelligence conducted a comprehensive analysis of U-boat losses and concluded what Klaus Hartmann had figured out months earlier. The British possessed direction-finding technology of unprecedented accuracy, and they were using it to hunt submarines with devastating effectiveness. Admiral Dönitz received the report on June 8, 1943. He read it twice, then sat in silence for 15 minutes. "How many boats have we lost to this?" he finally asked. "Impossible to determine exactly, Herr Admiral, but analysis suggests that between 40 and 60% of our losses since January 1943 can be attributed directly or indirectly to transmission detection and vectored counterattacks." 60%. Dönitz felt something he'd never experienced in his long naval career: complete strategic helplessness. He'd built the most powerful submarine fleet in history. He'd developed tactics that had nearly won the Atlantic War. He'd come within months of strangling Britain into submission, and it had all been undone by a technology he hadn't believed was possible. "Options?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Limited, Herr Admiral. We can impose complete radio silence, but that ends coordinated operations. We can develop new procedures, but any procedure that involves radio transmission will be compromised. We can attempt to overwhelm their detection network with false transmissions, but that requires resources we don't have. Or we can accept the casualties and continue operations, hoping that tonnage sunk still exceeds boats lost." Dönitz stood and walked to the window overlooking the submarine pens. Dozens of U-boats were visible, sleek grey shapes that represented Germany's last hope of winning the Atlantic War. But they weren't weapons anymore. They were coffins with engines. "Reduce operational patrols," Dönitz ordered. "Prioritize areas where air cover is limited. Impose strict radio discipline, and begin developing contingency plans for transitioning U-boat operations to a defensive posture." It was an admission of defeat, and everyone in the room knew it. The Battle of the Atlantic hadn't ended in June 1943, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany was losing. Not because their submarines weren't deadly, not because their tactics weren't sound, but because an overlooked BBC engineer had asked a question no one else had thought to ask, and a team of young women wearing headphones had answered it with devastating precision. Of those 28,000, approximately 28,000 died. The U-boat service had a 75% casualty rate, the highest of any military branch in any nation during the entire war. 3 out of 4 U-boat sailors never came home. Huffduff didn't kill all of them, but it tipped the balance from survivable danger to near certain death. Before Huffduff, the odds were bad, but manageable. After Huffduff, getting on a U-boat was statistically equivalent to Russian roulette with 5 bullets in the chamber. The Allied side had suffered terribly as well. 3,500 merchant ships sunk, 72,200 Allied sailors killed. Entire convoys wiped out, cities starved, industries crippled. But by 1944, the convoys were getting through. The food was arriving, the oil was flowing. Britain survived. And a significant portion of that survival was attributable to a direction-finding network that most people had never heard of. Robert Farnsworth received no public recognition during the war. His work was classified top secret, and he'd signed the Official Secrets Act. He returned to the BBC in 1946, continued working in radio engineering until his retirement in 1962, and never told his family exactly what he'd done during the war. He died in 1971, at age 73, in a small house in Berkshire. His obituary in the local newspaper described him as a wireless engineer who contributed to the war effort. It didn't mention that his invention had helped save Britain from starvation, or that he'd inadvertently killed thousands of German submariners by making their radios into targeting beacons. The full details of Huff Duff were declassified in 1977. By then, Farnsworth had been dead for 6 years. He never received the recognition he deserved. Patricia Morrison, the WREN operator who had detected Klaus Hartmann's final transmission, survived the war and became a school teacher in Wales. She never talked about her service except to say she'd worked in communications. Her students had no idea that their soft-spoken music teacher had once hunted submarines for a living. She was interviewed by a naval historian in 1998, at age 76, for an oral history project. When asked how many U-boats she'd personally helped locate, she estimated somewhere between 80 and 100. When asked how she felt about the men who died as a result, she was quiet for a long moment. "We were fighting for our survival," she finally said. "Those submarines were sinking ships carrying food for our children. I regret the necessity of it, but I don't regret doing it. War is evil, but sometimes you have to choose between evils. I chose to help stop the men who were starving my country." She died in 2003. Her obituary also failed to mention her role in the Battle of the Atlantic. Klaus Hartmann survived the war. He spent 2 years in a POW camp, was released in 1947, and returned to Germany. He never spoke publicly about his wartime service, but he wrote extensively in his private journals about the bitter realization that his own tactics had helped kill his comrades. In a journal entry from 1954, he wrote, "We were taught that courage, skill, and determination would carry the day. But we lost to mathematics and electronics. The British didn't outfight us, they outthought us. They saw a vulnerability in our procedures that we couldn't even imagine existed, and they exploited it ruthlessly. There's a lesson there about the nature of modern war, but I'm not sure what it is. Perhaps just that assumptions kill as surely as depth charges." Hartmann died in 1987 at age 69. He never fully reconciled his pride in his crew's bravery with his understanding of how completely they'd been outmaneuvered. The story of Huff Duff is rarely told in popular histories of World War II. Enigma gets the attention. Code-breaking at Bletchley Park gets the movies. But in many ways, Huff Duff was more important because it worked when Enigma couldn't be broken, and it continued working even after Enigma was compromised. It represented a fundamental shift in how wars are won, not through superior firepower or braver soldiers, but through information dominance. The side that knows where the enemy is, even if they don't know what the enemy is saying, has an almost insurmountable advantage. This lesson echoes through every conflict since. Radar, sonar, satellite reconnaissance, signal intelligence, cyber warfare. They're all descendants of the same insight that Robert Farnsworth had in 1942. You don't need to decrypt the message if you can locate the messenger. Modern militaries operate under the assumption that any radio transmission, any electronic emission, any digital communication can and will be detected, located, and exploited. This assumption shapes everything from tactics to equipment design to operational doctrine. The descendants of Huff Duff are all around us. GPS triangulation, cell phone tracking, internet packet routing. Every time your phone tells you where you are, it's using mathematical principles pioneered by a BBC engineer trying to find submarines in 1942. None will mention the balding engineer with thick spectacles who turned radio transmissions into death sentences. There is no memorial to Patricia Morrison or the hundreds of other WREN operators who sat in cold listening stations, wearing headphones for 12-hour shifts, plotting bearings and calculating triangulations. Their contribution was classified for 30 years after the war ended, and by the time it was acknowledged, most people had forgotten the Battle of the Atlantic had even happened. There is a memorial to the 28,000 German submariners who died. It stands in Miltenort, Germany, near the U-boat base at Kiel, a simple stone monument with the names of the dead. Among them, the crews of U-203, U-558, U-186, U-273, U-376, and thousands of others who transmitted routine radio messages and died shortly afterward, never understanding exactly what had killed them. War is full of these forgotten stories. The weapons that won battles, the people who invented them, the victims who never knew what hit them. History remembers the dramatic moments, the heroic charges, the famous names. It forgets the 19-year-old girl with headphones who heard a 30-second transmission and calculated a bearing that sent 47 men to the bottom of the Atlantic. It forgets the engineer who couldn't serve in combat, but saved his country by understanding that invisibility means nothing if you insist on speaking. And it forgets the submarine commander who figured out too late that his own orders were killing his friends, and died trying to warn them. The Battle of the Atlantic was won in many ways, but one of the most important victories happened in listening stations and plotting rooms, where mathematics and electronics transformed radio waves into execution warrants. The Germans called their Enigma machine unbreakable. They were right. But Robert Farnsworth had proven something more important. Sometimes you don't need to break the code. You just need to listen. The story you just heard changed the course of history. A BBC engineer with flat feet, a 19-year-old woman with headphones, and thousands of young men who never knew what killed them. If this story amazed you, hit that like button. It tells YouTube to share this with people who love untold history. And if you want more deep-dive historical investigations like this one, stories that take 15 to 25 minutes to tell properly because they deserve that time, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We don't do shallow summaries here. We do cinema-quality storytelling about the forgotten people who changed the world. There's someone in your life, a history teacher, a veteran, a grandfather who served, a friend who loves World War II documentaries, who needs to hear Robert Farnsworth's story. Send it to them. These stories die when we stop telling them.